One of the most aggravating realities in the era of Donald Trump is the way that inane and ridiculous things are dragged into the realm of importance. And when I say that, I don't mean that these things remain unimportant and we are forced to deal with them. What I'm referring to is that asinine things become enormously consequential because of this administration, its policies, and its actions. The current example of this, the number 86. Despite what the MAGA social media sphere, the conservative news folks, or even the president himself are insisting, the number 86 has not always meant kill. Now, I know, right out of the gate, that sounds like one of those sentences that shouldn't need to be said out loud. It feels like the kind of thing that if you said it at a bar, the person next to you would just nod with their eyebrows raised and go, yeah, okay. But yet, here we are. Because former FBI Director James Comey is now facing charges tied to a social media post. Not a manifesto, not a speech, not even a spoken sentence, but a picture. Seashells arranged on a beach, spelling out the numbers 8647. 8647. That's it. And according to Trump and a growing chorus of people who are very, very confident about this, that wasn't just a number. It was a message. It meant 86 him. Kill him. 8647. Kill the 47th president. And just to make sure nobody missed the point, Trump offered his own translation. He posted to Truth Social and he said it's a mob term, as in organized crime. He said the quote means 8 miles out, 6 feet down, which in and of itself is moronic. If you're 8 miles out, the water is much more than 6 feet deep, but I don't want to get off on that tangent. But think about this for a second, because even if what he said is true, if that's not just an interpretation, but the interpretation, if that's what that number clearly and historically means, then what we're looking at is ambiguous. It's not vague. It's not open to debate. It's a direct threat against the president of the United States. And if that's the case, if that's what this is, why did it take a year to bring these charges? Because threats against the sitting president are not subtle things that get filed away for later. They don't sit on a desk. They don't wait for a better news cycle. They're immediate. They're urgent. They are drop everything and deal with it now sort of urgent. So either this was that or it wasn't. And today I want to talk about this. I want to walk through something that sounds deceptively simple, but turns out to be doing a whole lot of heavy lifting in this entire situation. What does 86 actually mean? Because right now the meaning of the word isn't just a dictionary question. In essence, it's the entire case. Hello all, you're listening to a Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left, podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're going to be talking about numbers. Numbers and definition. And believe me when I tell you, that I am entirely aware of how ludicrous it sounds to have a conversation about numbers and definitions in a podcast that is supposed to focus on politics. I get it. Don't get me wrong. But nonetheless, here we are. James Comey, former FBI director, has been indicted because the Justice Department has decided that a meme that he posted a year ago with the numbers 8647 not only represent a reference to murdering the president, but also apparently represent a serious threat. So I suppose I should just jump right into this because, what else can we do here? Let's start off by slowing down and actually walking through what happened, for if there's anybody out there who doesn't know, because this is one of those stories where the details matter more than the headlines. James Comey posts a picture, not a paragraph, not a thread, not a video, a photo. Seashells on a beach, arranged in a way that spell out 8647. Clean, simple, almost casual, the kind of thing you might scroll past in half a second if you didn't already have a reason to be looking for something inside it. No caption explaining it, no follow-up clarifying it, just an image. Now, if you're a normal person, and I mean someone who's not plugged into political Twitter or X 24/7, and someone who's not marinating in cable news, not actively looking for coded messages and everything, you see that and your brain probably does one of two things. Maybe you recognize 86 from a restaurant or bar and think, okay, to get rid of something. Maybe you don't recognize it at all and you just think, I wonder what those four numbers mean. Why is he posting this? Or maybe you assume it's political in some vague way because everything is these days, but you don't really immediately jump to, oh my God, this is a death threat. Now, that's important. Hold on to that, because what happens next is where the shift occurs. The image starts getting attention. It moves from being a random post to being a thing. And I'm going to be honest with you here. He was one of millions of people who posted some version of these four numbers to their social media accounts. It was a meme. It became a meme. And in any case, it moved away from being that. It gets picked up and interpreted and this is key, framed. And very quickly, a specific interpretation starts to appear in the minds of certain people. 86 means kill. Not could mean, not in some contexts, not depending on how you look at it. It means that, full stop. And once that interpretation locks in, everything else sort of begins to fall in place around it. But also, I have to keep mentioning this. This happened a year ago. This happened a full year ago. But anyway, if you accept that definition, then 8647 isn't just a number anymore. It's a sentence. It's an instruction. It's intent packaged neatly into two digits and a political reference. And from there, the leap to this is a threat becomes a lot easier to make. Now, eventually, the Department of Justice brings charges at a high level, because we're not going to turn this into a law school lecture, but I'll mention this at a high level. Those charges hinge on the idea that this post crossed the line into an actual threat to the president. And here's where we need to be very clear about something. Cases involving threats are not just about words, they are about intent. Did the person intend to threaten? Would a reasonable person interpret it as a threat? is there context that clarifies or intensifies the meaning? Those are the kinds of questions that matter. Which brings us right back to the word doing all the heavy lifting here. 86. Because if that word means what Trump and the DOJ are saying it means, then the argument, it looks a lot stronger. But if it doesn't mean that, if the definition being used to interpret that image is shaky or stretched or just flat out wrong, well, then the entire case starts to wobble. And that's why we're not starting with Comey. We're not starting with politics. We're starting with the word. Because before you can decide what something means, you have to know what the words actually mean in the first place. And it's worth remembering, this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is a president who has openly talked about wanting the Justice Department to go after people that he believes have wronged him. And this is where things need to start getting a lot less dramatic and a lot more grounded in reality. So here's the thing. Before this became a political argument, before it became a legal question, before it turned into something people were debating on cable news panels, 86 lived a very unglamorous life. It lived in kitchens. It lived behind bars, and the kinds with taps and stools, not the kind with handcuffs and guards. It lived in the controlled chaos of places where nobody has time for long explanations because there are 12 tickets up, 2 cooks are arguing, and table 4 is asking where their food is for the 3rd time. That's where this word comes from. You go back to the 1930s, soda counters, diners, short order joints. These were fast-paced environments where communication had to be quick, clear, and efficient. You didn't have time to say, "We are unfortunately out of meatloaf at this time. Please adjust the order accordingly." You said, 86 the meatloaf. And everybody knew what it meant. We're out. We don't have meatloaf. Don't sell it. Move on. That's the origin of this word as we know it. Not mob code, not secret language, not anything that requires decoding, just shorthand. And over time, like a lot of workplace slang, it expanded. So now it's not just food. You're behind the bar, somebody's had one too many, they're loud, they're starting to get aggressive, and the bartender makes a call. Yeah, we're going to have to 86 that guy. Now, nobody hears that and thinks, oh my God, they're going to kill him. They're about to commit a felony. They think, yeah, he's getting kicked out. He's done, he's out. He's not being served anymore. And if you've ever actually seen it happen, it's not subtle. The bartender walks over, maybe there's a bouncer involved. There's a quick conversation and the person is escorted out the door. I mean, sometimes they protest, sometimes they don't, but the meaning is still crystal clear. They're not welcome here anymore. That is 86. And then, it keeps spreading because that's what language does. It moves from specific environments into general conversational use. So now you're in an office, you're talking with friends, you're in a group chat, whatever, and someone throws out an idea that's just, let's say not great. And someone says, yeah, let's 86 that. Again, nobody reads violence into that statement. It's a dismissal. It's a rejection. It's essentially saying, nope, we're not going to do that. And this is where it becomes really important to ground ourselves in how words are actually used, because we're not guessing here. We're not speculating. There are decades of consistent, documented usage. According to Merriam-Webster, 86 means to refuse service, to reject, or to get rid of something. That is the definition. That's not my political interpretation. I'm putting no spin on this. That is just how the word is defined. That is how it's been used. And here is a simple way to test this, because sometimes the easiest way to understand language is just to drop it into a sentence and see how it feels. If I say they 86'd the special tonight, you know exactly what I mean. If I say the bartender 86'd that guy, again, you don't get images of death. If I say, yeah, let's 86 that idea, you know what I'm talking about. So now if I told you they 86'd him and asked you without any additional context what that means, your first instinct is not going to be, well, clearly they murdered him. Context might shift how serious that sounds, sure, but the baseline meaning doesn't suddenly jump to homicide. And this is where things start to feel a little off, because what's being presented now is not just a different interpretation. It's a replacement of the common meaning with something far more extreme. And to understand how we got there, we have to ask the next question. If 86 so clearly means get rid of, why that number? Because this is where people start getting creative. So, what does 86 mean? We've got a solid answer. But if you ask why does it mean that, then things get more uncertain. There is no single universally accepted origin story for why the number 86 came to mean get rid of. And that's not particularly unusual. A lot of slang develops in environments where nobody's writing things down. Nobody's documenting it. It just happens. People start using it, other people pick it up, and before long, it's part of the language. The Oxford Dictionary adds new words to the dictionary every year, and many of them are slang terms. But that lack of a clean origin creates a vacuum. And as humans, we do not like vacuums. We don't like not knowing where things come from, so we start filling in the blanks. And some of those explanations are reasonable. The most widely accepted theory is that it comes from rhyming slang. 86 sounds like the word nix, N-I-X, and nix has meant no, cancel, or reject for a long, long time. So 86 it becomes a, clever way of saying nix it. And that sort of sounds logical, right? It's how language works. It fits how language works. It fits the time period. It fits the usage time period. Remember being back in the 30s. But then you've got the other explanations. There's a story about a bar in New York, Chumley's, where the address was 86 Bedford Street. And when trouble showed up, people would exit out the back. So 86 it meant get out. It's a cool story. No way to know if it's true. There are Prohibition-era theories about coded language used to warn of police. Again, possible, but not particularly well documented. And then there's the one that's suddenly everywhere, thanks to a Truth Social post. 8 miles out, 6 feet down. And I mean, you got to admit, that one has a little flair, right? It's vivid. It sounds like something out of a movie. It feels like insider knowledge. You've just been let in on something that most people don't know. But there's just one problem. There's no historical evidence for it. None. Zero. It doesn't show up in early uses of the term. It's not part of the slang records from the time when 86 actually entered the lexicon. It's what's called back formation, an explanation that came later designed to make the world feel more dramatic than it actually is. Think of it like retconning. If you're into serial books or serial like movie franchises where they come up with something in a subsequent edition of subsequent sequel or a subsequent part of the story that somehow fixes things by changing something that happened in the past. An explanation that came later. And this is something that we do all the time. We take something simple, something ordinary, and we retrofit it into a story that makes things more interesting. Because it probably came from rhyming slang at a diner, doesn't really have that pizzazz. But it's a mob term for disposing of a body. Well, now you've got something. And that's the danger here, because once that more dramatic explanation gets repeated enough times, it starts to feel true. Not because it's supported by evidence, but because it's memorable. And you hear it from someone speaking with confidence. You hear it framed as a fact. And if you hear it enough, you stop questioning it. That's sort of the president's whole communication dynamic. He's said it himself. And this is exactly how we get from a diner shorthand term, meaning we're out of meatloaf, to a claim that it's coded instructions to kill someone. And, once that happens, everything else just starts to follow. Now, here's the thing about language. It's not static. It's alive. It shifts. It bends. It stretches. Words pick up new meanings over time. Shed old ones, take on tone, sarcasm, exaggeration. If you freeze a word in place and expect it to behave the same way forever, you're probably going to be disappointed. But there's a difference, and this is a really important difference, between a word evolving and a word being redefined. Those are not the same thing. Evolution is organic. It happens slowly. People start using a word in a slightly different way. Other people pick it up, and over time, that usage becomes common enough that dictionaries take notice and say, all right, this is part of the meaning now. Take the word desktop. Us folks that exist in Gen X, when we were kids, desktop was the place where you sat your notebook when you were taking notes, or the place where your typewriter sat. But since the 90s, desktop has come to mean the main screen of a Windows-based computer. That's the clearest example that comes to my mind right now. So that's the evolution of a word. Redefinition, especially the kind we're dealing with here, is different. It's sudden, it's confident, and it often skips a step or many steps. Instead of saying, in some context, this word can be used more aggressively, it jumps straight to, this is what the word means. And once that happens, we've got a problem, because now we're not just stretching a word, we're replacing a word. Let me give you a couple of everyday examples here. If you hear someone say, oh, that joke killed, nobody pauses and goes, wait, someone died because of a joke? Certainly not. You understand instantly that it means the joke was really funny. Or someone who, is in for trouble says, oh, I am dead. Again, we're not dialing 911. You understand the exaggeration. You understand the tone. You get the gap between the literal meaning of the word and the way it's being used. That's language working normally. Now imagine someone takes that exaggerated usage, pulls it out of context, and then insists very confidently that this is the real meaning of the word. That there is no way that the word killed means anything but actual death. And that I am dead is a literal statement. It would sound ridiculous. And yet that's really not that far off from what's happening here. Because yes, if you really stretch the phrase get rid of far enough in the right context, you can push it towards something more extreme. Language allows for that. People use words loosely, metaphorically, dramatically, but that doesn't make that stretched meaning the default. It doesn't make that meaning the historical definition. And it definitely doesn't mean that every time the word appears, that's what it's communicating. So how does that stretch meaning start to take over? Well, usually it happens in 3 steps. First, rare usage. Someone at some point uses the word in a more extreme way. Maybe it's a joke, maybe it's sarcasm, maybe it's hyperbole, but it exists. Second is repetition. That usage gets picked up, it gets repeated. Not necessarily because it's accurate, because it's interesting. It sticks. And third, assumed meaning. After enough repetition, people stop treating it as one possible interpretation and start treating it as the interpretation. They hear the word, and instead of thinking, that could mean a few things, they think, oh, I know exactly what that means. Even if what they know isn't actually supported by how the word has been used historically. And once you hit that third step, once the assumed meaning takes hold, you don't need to argue anymore because people aren't questioning the definition. They're operating from it. And that's the shift we're watching here in real time. A word with a long, well-understood meaning being pulled into a new context, stretched, repeated, and then presented as if the new meaning has always been the obvious one. And once that happens, you can start building things on top of it. Arguments, narratives, and, even legal cases, I guess. Which brings us to the next piece of this, because this reinterpretation of 86 isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening for a reason. So let's strip this down to its simplest form. The meaning of the word determines the meaning of the act. Everything hinges on that. If 86 means get rid of, then Comey's post is ambiguous. Maybe it's political, maybe it's symbolic, maybe it's ill-advised, maybe it's nothing. But it's not a clear direct threat. But now flip that. If 86 means kill, then the ambiguity disappears. Now it's not a vague number, it's an instruction, it's intent. It's something you can point to and say, see, it's right there. And once you've got to that point, everything else becomes easier. You don't have to argue as hard about interpretation because you've already defined the terms in your favor. You don't have to dig as deeply into context because the word itself is doing all the work. This is why definitions matter. Not in some abstract academic sense, but in a very practical, real-world way. Because if you can change what the word means, you can change what the action means. If you can change what the action means, you can change how people respond to it. Think about how this plays out in real time. A claim is made very confidently. 86 means kill. It's simple, it's direct, it's easy to repeat. And when that kind of certainty shows up around a specific person in a political environment where targeting opponents has already been talked about out loud, it's hard not to notice where this might be headed. And then the phrase is reinforced with something vivid. This social media post that says 8 miles out, 6 feet down. That sticks in your head. It sounds like something you should have already known. It feels like insider knowledge. Like you've just been let in on a secret. And the more it's repeated, the more it feels like common knowledge, even if it wasn't. Even if a week ago, most people would have told you something very different. Well, maybe not a week ago, because again, this post was last year. And here's the part that's easy to miss. You don't have to convince everyone. You just have to convince enough people that the definition is settled. Because once that happens, the conversation moves on. It stops being, what does this word mean? It starts being, given what this word means, what should we do about it? And at that point, you've already won the first most important argument. The rest is just follow through. So far, everything we've talked about lives inside one case, one post, one interpretation, one set of charges, against Comey. But if you want to understand whether something is being applied fairly, you don't just look at it in isolation. You look for a comparison. And in this case, well, I mean, there are many. This post, these four numbers were used heavily since the beginning of 2025. But there is also a specific case that ties in here and I feel is a good representation. While Joe Biden was president, Jack Posobiec, a right-wing activist with a pretty significant online following, posted 86’d. Same structure, at 46 instead of 47 because Biden was the 46th president. Now, slow down for a second here because it matters. 86’46. If we accept the definition that's being used now, the one being used by the DOJ and pushed in the Comey case, then that phrase carries the same implication. It has to. It's not just similar. It's not adjacent. It's the same. Because if 86 clearly and obviously means kill, then attaching it to 46, the 46th president, should have triggered the exact same reaction. Same interpretation, same concern, same supposed urgency. That didn't happen. There were no federal charges. There was no investigation that I've been able to find anything about, no widespread framing of it as a direct assassination threat, no major legal escalation built around the interpretation. I don't believe there was even an inquiry by the Secret Service. And again, they would have been awfully busy if they tracked down every person who posted 86’47. No, this one just existed. It circulated and then it moved on. Now, in a recent interview, acting Attorney General Blanche was asked about this comparison, and he refused to draw one. He just deflected to something about how grand juries work. That's not how grand juries work, was what he said. I'm not even sure what he meant by that, because the question was about the DOJ's response or lack thereof it. As in, why was there no investigation of this? Or should the DOJ investigate this? But his refusal to address the question, although common these days, is interesting because on its face, the comparison is pretty straightforward. Same phrase, same structure, and we have to assume they would believe the same meaning. So if the meaning of 86 is as clear and as settled as the DOJ is presenting it now, why isn't it treated that way for Posobiec's post? And this is where you don't have to jump up and down and scream double standard. You don't have to pound the table. You just have to ask the question, because the question does all the work. If the definition is consistent, the response should be consistent. And if the response isn't consistent, then something else is driving this. Something else is driving the interpretation. And that something else doesn't have to be named outright. The listener can connect that dot, because once you see two clearly identical examples handled very differently, it becomes a lot harder to argue that the definition itself is the deciding factor here. It starts to look like the definition is being applied, adjusted, maybe even created, depending on the situation. And that's when the whole thing starts to feel less like a clean, objective reading of language and more like something else entirely. Because if the meaning of the word changes depending on who uses it, then the word is not really the issue. Now let's go back to that question from the cold open, because it's not just a throwaway line. It's actually one of the biggest tells in this entire situation. Comey posts the image in May of 2025. The indictment comes in April of 2026. Just about a year. Now think about how threats against a sitting president are typically handled. Not hypothetically, but in reality. When law enforcement becomes aware of a credible threat to the President of the United States, the response is immediate. It doesn't sit, it doesn't wait, it doesn't go through months of public debate or behind the scenes deliberation before something's done. It's investigated right away, it's given the highest priority, and if there's something there, it's acted on right away. Protecting the president is not a, you know what, let's circle back to that one sort of situation. It's urgent by definition. So when you see a timeline like this, you have to ask yourself a very basic question. If this was so clearly and obviously a threat, why wasn't it treated like one? Because there are really only a couple of possibilities. Either it was immediately recognized as serious, credible threat, and for some reason, nothing happened for a year, or it wasn't. And it took time. It took time for interpretation. It took time for framing. It took time to build a narrative into something that could support action. Now, I'm not sitting here with access to, internal DOJ discussions, obviously. I'm not pretending to know exactly what conversations took place behind closed doors, but do I really need to? Because the timeline is public and the timeline raises questions. Just quiet, persistent questions that don't go away. If this was urgent, why wasn't it urgent? If this was obvious, why did it take so long? Threats don't sit, they move, unless what you're looking for isn't a clear threat, but something that had to be turned into one. And this is where I want to zoom out, because it would be easy to look at this and say, all right, it's one case, one weird situation involving a number and a social media post, but it's really not about that. It's about something much broader. It's about language, because language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. And if you can define the word, you can define the intent. And if you define the intent, you define the action. And now you can define the response. That's the chain. And it all starts with the meaning of the word. So when you see a word with a long, well-established meaning being pulled into a new context, and that meaning being stretched, reframed, and presented as something more extreme, it's not just a linguistic curiosity anymore. It's a shift in how we interpret behavior. And that shift doesn't stay contained. Once people get comfortable with alternate definitions for words, it becomes easier to redefine others. And before long, you're not arguing about what someone did, you're arguing about what the words describing it mean. And that's a much harder argument to win, because it's not about facts anymore, it's about perception. And perception is pliable. It can be shaped, repeated, reinforced, simplified, until something that started out as a stretch starts to feel like common sense. That's how narratives are created. Not all at once, but piece by piece, definition by definition. Until one day you look at something and you think, well, of course, that's what that meant. Even if a little while ago you would have said something completely different. So let's be honest about what this looks like, because we just spent this entire episode walking through the language and the history and the definitions and the timeline, and none of it quite lines up. The word doesn't mean what it's being claimed to mean. The urgency doesn't match the delay. The standard doesn't match the comparison. And the context, again, a president who has openly talked about wanting the Department of Justice to go after people he believes wronged him, isn't exactly subtle. So at some point, you have to stop treating this like it's a linguistic puzzle. It's not. It isn't about decoding a number. It's about what you can build on top of it. Because when you take a word that's been used one way for nearly a century and you stretch it just far enough and you repeat that stretched meaning with enough confidence, you can start to turn something into something that sounds solid. You could take something ambiguous and present it as obvious. You could take a post that might raise an eyebrow and turn it into a federal case. Literally. And once you see that process, this doesn't feel like a misunderstanding. It doesn't feel like a close call. It doesn't even feel like a particularly strong argument, to be honest. It feels like a justification, a way to get from point A to point B, even if the straight line between them doesn't really exist. You don't need a secret code to understand what's happening here. You just need to look at the pattern. When you do, this doesn't look like careful interpretation of language. It looks like language being used as cover. And the more you look at it that way, the less it feels like justice, and the more it starts to feel like something else entirely. Something a whole lot closer to retribution. All right. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. I'm thrilled that you did, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. I want to hear what you think about this case that the DOJ is bringing against James Comey. Do you think it has a chance? Do you think that it's what they claim it is, or do you think that it's just a thinly veiled retribution? If you go to the website for the podcast, www.neighborontheleft.com, go to the contacts page. You can use any of the social media links to direct message the podcast, or you can use the email address that's there, and you can send your communication that way. You can also go to the episodes page while you're there, and you can stream or download any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And you can go to the blog section where I post the topics that I talk about in the podcast, and I include all of the sources that I use for the information that I present. I think that's pretty important these days. I will be back on Monday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.